on poetry and psychiatry to mark the World Poetry Day by Indian Psychiatric Society Karnataka chapter. I welcome on behalf of IPSKC the speakers, Professor R. Raghuram and Dr. R. Tarini Shubhadayini. Actually, this particular webinar was originally planned by IPS, Indian Psychiatric Society, the national body, but then somehow tomorrow the EC meeting is happening at Hyderabad and things didn't work out to gather a national audience. So I thought I was not for leaving it. So I thought at least since it's a webinar, we should be able to do it in Karnataka platform. And I actually just 4 days back, on the suggestion of Professor Raghuram sir, I approached IPSKC and Dr. N.M. Patil sir and our secretary, honorary secretary, Dr. Harsha. Both of them immediately responded very enthusiastically, and as always, Dr. N.M. Patil encouraged, saying that, if you want to do it, then it doesn't clash with any other program, then go ahead. And that's why the webinar became a reality today. And I'm happy that, there are people already who are here. So the webinar itself has said, actually, this is to mark the World Poetry Day, which is supposed to be on March 21st. According to the UNESCO, this day celebrates one of the humanity's most treasured forms of cultural and linguistic expression and identity, and to promote reading, writing, and teaching of poetry across the world. The humanities and medicine, humanities in medical post-graduation as well as psychiatry post-graduation is one of the upcoming areas. In UK and US, actually, they teach poetry in medical schools. And I thought the World Poetry Day also should mean something to us as psychiatrists. So I would like to open this webinar with a words from a very famous poem by John Henry Newman, which is incidentally is it is in 1927. This was translated to Kannada by Professor B.M. Shrikantaya. So it's a very famous verse, and this poem, actually, when I thought that this poetry webinar should happen, then I remembered suddenly this particular poem, which I had learnt as a child to sing. And Karunalu Babelake, Musukidi Mabbinali, Kai Hididu Nadasennanu, Irulu Kattelayagavi, Manedura Kanikarisi, Kai Hididu Nadasennanu. So this particular poem used to offer me a lot of solace, lot of comfort whenever I was in confusion about day-to-day things. So I thought this should be the prayer today. So with Karunalu Babelake, we first we move on to actually today's welcome was supposed to be done by our secretary, Dr. Harsha, but he is unable to join. So I welcome both the speakers, Professor Raghuram. I very distinctly remember his brainstorming sessions in Professor R.R. unit, as we called, when we were having our residency at Nimhans, and he used to have brainstorming sessions on just internet or astrology, poetry, films, then, how to set up private practice. All these things we have discussed with a very, vibrant discussion. So when I thought of poetry and psychiatry, I suddenly remembered Professor Raghuram's name, and I approached him, and he has been kind enough to, accept our invitation and is here to speak for us today. And if I remember correctly, Professor R. Raghuram's mother herself was a very good poet. I don't know. I mean, I distinctly remember somewhere that, vaguely remember rather. So I welcome Professor Raghuram. Then we have another speaker, Dr. Tarini Shubhadayini. And I've got hold of two young psychiatrists, my colleagues, Dr. Shubhrata and Dr. Aruna Yediyal, to introduce our speakers. Now, that is for a very specific reason, because Dr. Shubhrata has been using poetry in her dance presentations as a psychiatrist, wherein Mankutimana Kagga by DVG has been used by her to bring out the art of life and how exactly poetry can help a person to improve their quality of life. And Dr. Aruna Yediyal, another young psychiatrist, herself is a very good poetess. And so I thought that these two younger colleagues should be involved in this program somehow. So I asked them to introduce both the speakers, and they are going to do that job. And of course, our ever enthusiastic president is here, Dr. N.M. Patil, sir. I welcome him. And all the audience, there are varied, people from different, fields of society. There are writers themselves, there are poets, there are doctors, doctor writers. So I welcome all of you, and I call upon Dr. Shubhrata to introduce Professor Raghuram. Shubhrata.
A very good evening to all of you. I consider it as an honor to introduce Professor Raghuram, popularly known as RR. Dr. Raghuram is a well-known teacher and researcher in the field of psychiatry. He worked for over 2 decades as professor of psychiatry at NIMHANS. He was the coordinator of the psychotherapy training program for residents. Subsequently, he went to UAE to initiate a postgraduate residency program in psychiatry for the first time in that region. After completing this assignment, he was professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry at KIMS, Bangalore. His main interest has been the field of cultural psychiatry, wherein he has employed an anthropological approach to examine cultural and contextual determinants of psychiatric problems. A Commonwealth Fellowship facilitated his tenure at the Department of Cultural Anthropology at the University College London, and subsequently as a WHO Fellow, he worked at the Department of Culture, Community and Health Studies at the University of Toronto. He has over 50 research publications and chapters in books. He has received several awards, both nationally and internationally, to name a few: D.L.N. Murthy Rao Award, Eminent Psychiatry Award, Bombay Psychiatric Society Silver Jubilee Award, etc. He is the founder trustee of the NGO Padai, which is involved in education for the underprivileged and children. Besides his academic involvements, Professor Raghuram is a nature enthusiast, an avid bird watcher with an abiding interest in the visual arts. This was a very brief, formal introduction, but then I have 2 to 3 lines to add to it. My personal introduction of him. I think, I must congratulate Dr. Pavitra and the organizing team for having selected Dr. Raghuram, because Professor Raghuram is a true Sahridaya or a Kalarasika. We all know who is a Sahridaya, whether it's a sculpture, a painting, or a photo. RR always has a way to put it across to others with profound lines, words, or poem from literature. So who better than RR for today's topic? Thank you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shubhrata. So without further delay, Dr. Tarini also is here. So I welcome Dr. Tarini Shubhadayini, whose introduction will be done just prior to her talk. So we would first start with Professor RR's talk. Dr. Bhimsen?
Yes, madam.
I think sir has a PowerPoint to share.
Okay. I'll make him co-host as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
I request all the other audience to mute yourselves. We have an interaction after both the talks are over. So, after the talks, all of you can
Sir, you are a
unmute
host.
yourself one by one so that you can ask questions and interact with both the speakers. Yes, sir. I think you can share your PowerPoint. Yeah.
One second. Tell me why I'm not able to share. Oh, it's here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
One second. Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for a very introduction. Both of you. And can you hear me?
Sir, we can hear you. I think Dr. Bhimsen, please mute all others.
Yes, madam, I'll do that.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, I think, yeah, there's going to be disturbance.
It's okay now?
Sir, one second. He's just muting everybody. Dr. Sudarshan, sir, please mute yourself. Sudarshan, sir.
I have muted.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, you can go ahead.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, good evening to everybody, and thank you, Shubrata, for your warm words of introduction. Couple of days earlier, we ushered in the World Poetry Day, and I think it's timely and very pertinent that we are inquiring into the interface between poetry and therapy this evening. I must deeply appreciate the effort made by the ever-dynamic persons who are involved in organizing it at a very short notice. I'm also equally honored to have as a co-speaker a very talented and very well-known Kannada poetess, Dr. Tarini. Personally, I have always been fascinated with poetry. Poetry has an irresistible appeal to me, and I have also dabbled in poetry, wrote a couple of them, it were published, and translated several of them. Over a period of time, from written poetry, I have shifted over to the visual medium in terms of visual poetry, and I find it equally enchanting. Over the course of next couple of minutes, let me take you on a journey as to what are the healing powers of poetry. And in doing so, I'll be outlining the potentials of poetry and what kind of impact it can have, and it has had, on psychological distress. When you talk about poetry, the most important statement personally to me is the one that came in the movie Dead Poets Society. Why am I not able to move? Any idea? Yep, I do. Sorry. In Dead Poets Society, there was this interesting mention. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are, of course, very noble pursuits and extremely necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, and of course, love, these are what we stay alive for. Basically, we are immersed in a universe of poetry. Poetry is everywhere around us, but sometimes we notice, sometimes we hardly notice it. Let us look at this particular photograph, which I sourced from the net. This portrays a cobbler in Mumbai who is sitting on the pavement on a busy hot day after finishing his work or in between his work, and intently reading a book. If you look closely at the book, you will notice the title. He's reading a book of poems by Guru Ravidas. Who was Guru Ravidas? Guru Ravidas was a mystic poet saint of 15th century. He was born as a cobbler in Varanasi and spent his time mending the leather things of all the devotees who used to visit Varanasi. But he was also a very important spiritual figure and a noted social reformer. In addition, he was an extremely talented poet, and he was one of the first to use poetry as a vehicle of spiritual communication. Much later, another poet called Dhumil wrote about a cobbler called Mochiram. And he wrote, "No man is big or small, dark or fair. Everyone is merely a pair of shoes that stand before me awaiting repair." When I look at these lines, this is what we try to do as psychotherapists. This is the essence of psychotherapy, which has been crystallized in few words by using the analogy of what a cobbler does. Personally, the question is whether poetry can really catalyze changes in therapy, and what could be the role of poetry in terms of ushering in changes in distressed minds. Poetry has immense potential. Poetry can tap into the creative aspects of life. It can also unravel deeply enmeshed feelings of various genres, some of them very difficult to express and articulate, which are deeply buried in the unconscious. So poetry has a very significant role by itself to tap the unconscious and gives it ways of expression. When we talk about the unconscious, the person who comes to our mind is, of course, Sigmund Freud, who is often referred to as the discoverer of the unconscious. During the celebration of his 70th birthday, one of his disciples hailed him as the discoverer of the unconscious. Freud's answer was quite simple. He said, "The poets and philosophers before me have discovered the unconscious. What I discovered was the scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied." It would be very hard to imagine a single feeling that has not been expressed in a poem, whether it is love, loss, anguish, joy, betrayal, excitement, disappointment, and fear. These are all the stuff of poetry. Another poet called Seamus Heaney very perceptively commented that poetry is a revelation of self to the self. When we talk about the revelation of self-self, another aspect surfaces, that there are occasions in which there can be fractures within the self. And these fractures can occur between our imagined and imaginative lives and what passes on as the so-called shared reality. Once there is a fracturing of self, we enter into the shadow lands of psychological distress. I use the word shadow lands because psychological distress, even now, elicits a lot of fear and anxiety. And basically, people feel it's a very uneasy, uncertain terrain to venture into. So shadow lands of psychological distress, as it is enacted in the inner landscapes of poets. What I will do over the next couple of slides is to narrate as to how poets who were in the midst of psychological distress articulated their suffering and give vent to it in words. The first person who comes to my mind is Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath has a huge hold on me because I read her book, Bell Jar, as a medical student decades ago. It was a very gripping, semi-autobiographical narrative of a talented young poet. Sylvia Plath's career was marked by tumultuous emotional distress and tumultuous relationship issues with her equally talented poet husband, Ted Hughes. In one of her poems called The Lazarus, which she wrote in her own words, early morning, when the whole world is silent, before the children get up, and in the absence of my husband, she was in deep distress, and she wrote, "Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well." She did it in the background of several suicidal attempts. Suicidal attempts, which are basically a cry for help for her to really negotiate a disturbed emotional life and disturbed interpersonal relationships. She also wrote that even though I attempted suicide and I felt very depressed and lost, I came out of the ash of all these turmoils, and I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. Probably what she meant as men is a synonym for her husband, Ted Hughes. Recently, there is a very young, talented poetess called Rupi Kaur. She is very, very popular in Instagram. She has written several books of poetry, and she also underwent distressing episodes of depression. And she shared it very widely in the net. In one of her poems, she wrote, "Yesterday when I woke up, the sun fell to the ground and rolled away. Flowers beheaded themselves. All that is left alive is me, and I barely feel like living." This is one of the most articulate expressions of depression, much better than what you can see in any psychiatric text. Another person who was also a doctor, yet at the same time having issues of psychological distress, wrote this poem anonymously. He said to the doctor, "To you, I am a brief moment, a problem. If not solved, then put aside. My anguish is interesting to you, but cannot touch you. To me, your hope, you will say the forgotten words that will mend the frayed thread of my existence. Trembling, I wait for what never comes." What it expresses again is the anguish of whether others are able to resonate within the psychological distress experienced by a person, especially if it happens to be a person from the mental health discipline. Frans Stromer, who was a Swedish psychologist and poet, summarized the situation very, very succinctly. He said, "I am carried in my shadow of psychological distress like a violin in its black case." Closer home, Kamala Das wrote a very powerful poem about psychiatric illnesses and how psychiatric illnesses can be perceived in a situation in which people feel helpless and unwanted. She wrote, "Madness is a country just around the corner whose shows are never lit. But if you go there, ferried by despair, the sentries will ask you to strip. At first the clothes, then the flesh, and later, of course, your bones. Their only rule is freedom." There was another extremely talented poetess called Elizabeth Jennings, who was also hospitalized several times for her manic depressive illness. She wrote a poem about her stay in the asylum called The Night Garden of the Asylum. An owl's call scrapes the silk stillness. Curtains are barriers, and behind them, the beds settle into neat rows. Soon they'll be ruffled. The garden knows nothing of the illness. Only it knows of the slow gleam of stars, the moon's distilling. It knows why the beds and lawns are leveled. Then all is broken from its fullness. A human cry cuts across the dream. A wild hand squeezes an open rose. We are in witchcraft bedeviled. All these poems by very talented poets express deep distress in a way that is extremely poetic. And these moving words are quite poignant, heartbreaking to a large extent, and extremely powerful. For example, Kamala Das's perception of madness. They also deepen our understanding about the psychological distress. Basically, we are all immersed and entangled in various emotional dialogues within ourselves and in our relationships. Often we do not speak or share them. And I feel that poetry can provide us an avenue to express and untangle these emotional issues. Hence, poetry, I would feel, is both a window into our inner selves and as well as the world around us. It enables a clearer view of our connectedness within ourselves and the outer world. Let me borrow a very interesting poem by Jayant Kaikini, which amplifies the stance. He wrote, "The poem's last word is gazing elsewhere, like a child at the window seat, being both inside and outside." When we talk about the advent of poetry therapy, we must remember that it's not a recent phenomenon. If you look back in history, early Egyptians wrote poetry in papyrus and then dissolved them in liquid and gave them to those who were sick to drink as a form of medicine. And throughout history, there are very well documented uses of poetry in terms of addressing human suffering. But in modern days, the person who gave a formulation of sorts to poetry therapy and organized it as an interventional medium is a person called James Pennebaker. And he wrote a book called The Healing Power of Poetry. And there is also another person, a very important person, who developed a model of poetry therapy, which is called as the RES model of Nicholas Maza. R refers to the receptive and prescriptive aspects in therapy, which involves introduction of an already existing poetry in therapy to facilitate expression of deep-seated emotional distress. E stands for expressive and creative, encouraging clients through expression of poetry, about which I'll give an example later on. And we could also use S, symbolic, by using metaphors and symbols in therapeutic process. So these two leading figures in the field of poetry therapy have heralded the advent of poetry in therapy in a very, very major fashion. And as usual, there is a profusion of many, many publications which address the area of poetry therapy in much greater detail. And there is also a Journal of Poetry Therapy, and very interestingly, a National Association of Poetry Therapy. See, if we look at what could be the role of poetry in psychotherapy, the work of psychotherapy essentially is to explore the experiential realm of clients through a reflective stance, exploring distressing emotions, acknowledging and working through them, and facilitating their expression, often through words. in a largely empathic communicative context. And poetry can be an instrument and a catalyst in the process to effect changes in patients in the throes of emotional distress. What are the applications of poetry therapy? There are hundreds and hundreds of publications. Many of them are case reports. Some of them are series of case reports which document the impact of poetry therapy across various kinds of psychological ailments, starting from anxiety to depression to PTSD. There is a whole lot of psychological illnesses in which poetry has been used as a therapeutic medium. Let me just highlight as to what is the role of poetry in grief work. Shakespeare said it very succinctly in Macbeth. He said, "Canst thou minister to your mind deceased? Pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart." Thomas Gunn, another very important poet, wrote very perceptively about what happens when a person is going through a grief process. He wrote, "About 10 days or so after we saw you dead, you came back in a dream. 'I'm all right now,' you said. And it was you, although you were fleshed out again. You hugged us all around then and gave you a welcoming beam. How like you to be kind, seeking to reassure. And yes, how like my mind to make itself secure." Rumi also mentioned about grief. He said, your grief is for what you have lost, life's mirror, up to where you are bravely working. Expecting the worst, you look, and instead, here is the joyful face you have been wanting to see. Your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always stretched upon, open, you will be paralyzed. Your deepest presence is in every small contracting and expanding, the two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings. And this is the stuff of grief therapy. What is the orientation in grief therapy? Again, I rely on Shakespeare to say, he said, "Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers over the fraught heart and bids its break." Sometime back, I had a young mother who lost the child soon after birth. It was a very prized pregnancy, and it was the first pregnancy too. And she was quite in deep grief. She came for several sessions. In most of the sessions, she used to sit silently in front of me, sometimes softly crying, but not speaking a word. I gave her the space and time to feel comfortable in my presence. After 3 sessions, I picked out a poem purely randomly called "The Card" by Amy Merrick and handed it over to the patient sitting across. Let me read the poem. "We are connected, my child and I, by an invisible cord, not seen by the eye. It is not like the cord that connects us till birth. This cord can't be seen by any on earth. This cord does its work right from the start. It binds us together, attached to my heart. I know that it is there, though no one can see, the invisible cord from my child to me. The strength of this cord is hard to describe. It can't be destroyed. It can't be denied. It is stronger than any cord man could create. It withstands the test, can hold any weight. And though you're gone, though you're not here with me, the cord is still there, but no one can see. It pulls at my heart. I am bruised. I am sore. But this God is my lifeline as never before. I'm thankful that God connects us this way, a mother and child. Death can't take it away. When she read it aloud, as she was reading it aloud, tears were rolling from her eyes, and she cried for almost 5-10 minutes. And she went over and read this poem again and again. And she said, this poem has touched me in ways that no other words has touched me before. What it facilitated in that session is the poet's articulation of what happens when a mother loses a child, which found resonance in a person struggling with her own grief. And it also provided an opportunity and occasion for her to ventilate her feelings, which she was holding dearly back till then. Subsequently, this session, in which poetry brought about a kind of recognition for the person as to how the loss that she has faced can be sorted and worked through, prepared the stage for the grief work, which I undertook over a course of next 10 sessions. So essentially, this particular poem was a catalyst in terms of facilitating very deeply seated feelings which a person found very difficult to articulate. This has been commented. I can't find a better kind of a summary of what happened in the session than this poem by Amit Majumdar. Amit Majumdar was the first poet laureate of Ohio. He's a nuclear radiologist. He said, I had no words until our bodies folded shut, our bodies closed around hope, like a book preserving its petals, a book we did not open till the morning when we found hope dry and brittle, but intact. So the essence of any kind of therapy facilitated and catalyzed by poetry is facilitation and emergence of hope. Again, Emily Dickinson said it very powerfully. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words, never stops at all. So how can poetry be helpful in therapy? It can be helpful as a vehicle for expression of emotions, as I outlined. Which might otherwise be very difficult to express. It can also promote self-reflection and exploration and increase self-awareness, help individuals to redefine their troubled situation by opening up new ways of perceiving, validating emotional experiences that they are experiencing, and help therapists, most importantly, to gain deeper insight into the emotional realm of patients in throes of psychological distress. So basically, poetry gives rhythm to silence and brings light to darkness. Poetry can also be a form of meditation because it encourages a sense of mindfulness and the ability to tap into what we are feeling, seeing, and experiencing. Basically, poetry is the shortest emotional distance between two people. And it can work as a bridge that can connect us in difficult times and help clients who are in the throes of intense emotional distress. Jung said it very perceptively. He said the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light of meaning in the darkness of mere being, and poetry can play a very significant role in that. Let me end this short presentation with a small verse of my own. As I tread on shadowlands, flickers of fireflies light my path. And for me, these fireflies are poems. And poems like fireflies can not light up the path, not just of ourselves, but also of our clients. Thank you so much.
So that was really wonderful presentation. Very, I felt touched. So thank you very much, sir. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, enlightening presentation, because we keep seeing lots of clients who have problems. And I think if we ourselves read poetry, not just psychiatrists, I think all doctors, if we read poetry, we will be able to understand our patients better. And I think it is important that we realize the importance of humanities in the practice of medicine, and that makes us more actual, human doctors, not just machine doctors. So thank you very much, sir. So without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Aruna Yediyar. Sir, I think you need to stop sharing.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yeah.